Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 9 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Sara Hastings-Simon and David Keith. If you worry about climate change, as I imagine we all do, we've had some discouraging news of late. So earlier this week, we got a comprehensive new report from the UN, the United Nations, the second part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report, that prompted headlines like half of humanity at risk from impacts of climate change and delay means death. And in fact, our guest today, whom I'll introduce shortly, was one of the authors of that IPCC report. Two, in Washington, President Biden's ambitious climate change legislation has all but been killed by unanimous Republican opposition and killed by the Democratic senator from the coal-producing state of West Virginia, Joe Manchin, who is heavily supported by the fossil fuel industry. Three, we know what Russia is doing to Ukraine is awful, despicable, and likely criminal. It's also laying bare Europe's economic resilience on Russian fossil fuels like natural gas. And as humanitarian crises do, it's drawing attention away from long-term crises like climate change. So it really feels like we could use some encouraging news for a change. Well, look no further than the stunning evolution of solar power technology and its cost. The cost of solar power has decreased by a factor of 1,000 over the last 50 years, and by a factor of 10,000 since it was first used to power satellites in the mid-1950s. And in some sunny regions, solar is now the cheapest energy available, and that's cheaper than the fossil alternatives. Today, we're going to unpack solar's multi-decade cost decline to see if there are any lessons that are applicable to other forms of climate tech, like energy storage and carbon capture. And to help us, we've enlisted Dr. Gregory Nemet, as he literally wrote the book on the topic a couple of years ago in a book called How Solar Energy Became Cheap, a model for low carbon innovation. Greg is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in his La Follette School of Public Affairs, where his research focuses on the understanding of the process of tech change and the ways in which public policy affects it. Greg was named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow in 2017. He was awarded the inaugural World Citizen Prize in Environmental Performance by the Association for Public Policy and Analysis in 2019. And as I mentioned earlier, he is a lead author for the IPCC's 6th assessment report. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Ed. It's great to be on the show.
So here's the format for the next hour, the usual format. We'll talk news and not news to start. I will then guide us through a discussion on our topic today until about 45 minutes, or rather 15 minutes past the next hour. And after that, we'll get to your questions. You can send them in via the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Please don't use the raise hand function or chat box. And today, our producer, Eva Voinigescu, will help us to manage the questions and the live questioners. So let's start things off with this week's energy versus climate news and not news segment. And I think we can't help but focus on the climate and energy implications of the war in Ukraine. David, Sara, who wants to start?
Go for it, David. Well, starting maybe a little bit with the personal. I taught two classes today. I taught an extra class, Megan O'Sullivan's global energy and class, because she herself, as is now public, was asked by the White House to fly to Taiwan and talk to the Prime Minister of Taiwan to give them some comfort about the U.S. point of view. She was unusually for the Kennedy School, a Republican, was on Bush's National Security Council, is very trusted in these matters. And so it's impossible not to think about just how quickly these implications are spreading. And maybe just on a personal note to say, I visited many of those cities that we're hearing about now in the 1976 with my Jewish grandmother. Her parents had come from there, and we actually visited that memorial to this Jewish massacre at Baba Yag that the Russians just bombed. So there's no getting out of the fact that it's pretty real. And I think that the consequences for spending on energy and climate are unclear, But I think it's easy to construct arguments that while this will have some benefits and maybe pushing renewables faster in Europe, it will push attention away from energy and climate, as maybe you saw in the State of the Union. And lest you get sort of too excited about the way that some of these kind of spending post a crisis can help, there was I thought, a very interesting paper that came out in the commentary section of Nature in the last couple of days from Upalainen and colleagues that totaled up the fraction of the total global kind of build back better, that's the US phrase, but the COVID spending that was related to emissions reductions. And their overall estimate is 6%. And in many ways, that actually may be charitable. And two countries that are relevant to this conversation, Canada and the US, US showed basically no change. Canada actually showed some change, a reduction in emissions spending.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, I find it hard to almost comment on the implications right now because, I mean, we're in the middle of a war and that sort of overshadows, I think, everything when it comes to what this means right now. That said, I guess if we start to look ahead in the coming, months to a year and what might happen afterwards, there certainly are signs of action that's moving ahead, right? So the IEA in particular released a plan today that they believe would put Europe on a path to reduce Russian gas imports by somewhere around up to a half to a third, something like that, over the next year. I think that's pretty significant in the sense that, if you could put together a plan that gets you halfway, you're sort of close to a plan that gets you all the way there. And that's really a mix of, what one would expect to see. So imports from other places, but also really ramping up installation of heat pumps and efficiency and new generation, renewable energy generation on the electricity side. So I think there'll be, actions that's taken in the sort of medium term. I did also go back just to sort of remind myself, having not lived through it like some of my co-hosts might have, the oil embargo experience and what happened in the period following that.
Oh, that's a dig about age. Yes, I do remember the gas lines in 1973. Damn you.
Maybe David
lived through it, but we just don't remember it, Sarah.
And one of the things that I'm far from an expert here. I mean, other people have written much more about it. But one of the things that struck me in looking at this, in this case, EIA report that came out, I think it was about 25 years after that crisis was, that short-term stuff is quite short-term, but it did really follow a relatively long, 20-year period of some pretty dramatic changes in the energy system in various ways. So, the consumption of barrels of oil per person in the US, for example, dropped from where it was in 1972 and has actually never recovered as high. I was surprised by that. I actually checked it again because I was like, that can't be true. We must be using more now. Some of the energy efficiency measures also, the efficiency of fridges got at like 3,000% or 3 times more efficient. So, I think there is the extent to which dramatic effects can really spur policymakers to take big action, I think is something that we've seen before. And so I do expect that, in the period coming out of, say, a year following where, you're still very much in crisis mode, we could see acceleration of some of these trends as a result.
Yeah, and I've been encouraged. It's great that energy strategy aimed at weaning the EU, the continent, off Russian gas is really getting some legs now. What I worry about is what we're acknowledging in the short term is that the EU, if you want to get off Russian gas, you can implement these measures. They take time. They're going to need imports of liquefied natural gas, principally from the United States, to make up some of that shortfall. And going back to 2014, around the time when Russia was annexing Crimea, I was at a World Economic Forum event in Dubai. And at the time, I chalked this up to conspiracy theorist lunacy. But I remember people talking then about, one, the West encroaching on Russia's sphere of influence and sort of the powder keg-like aspect of that. But two, the conspiracy theorists were saying this could be a catalyst to create a new offtake market for U.S. natural gas. And so what we're actually seeing now is genuinely, looking at U.S. LNG exports as a substitute. And if you lock that in, then how much is that actually going to depress the EU's longer term strategy to get off gas through efficiency and through other measures? So I worry about that.
Oh, go ahead, Greg.
Well, I was just going to chime in. For me, the first impression is, as you mentioned, it's just tremendous human suffering. But then the second is this really does have, as Sara mentioned, the potential to be seen as a focusing event. So something that people don't forget about, and that potentially creates some kind of consensus. And that's one of the rare times on energy policy, in some of the ways that Sara mentioned, that we had consensus, because right and left, bipartisan, multiple countries, there was this idea we need to get more efficient. We needed to get off of foreign oil, and a lot of investment followed. A lot of really serious policies followed, including doubling the fuel efficiency of cars. That has the potential to happen again, but it's not clear what direction that goes in. So we often talk about wanting energy that's cheap, that's clean and reliable. And if we're thinking about climate change, that clean part has been really important. If we're thinking about the current crisis, what Europe's really focused on is reliability and how that connects to geopolitics. And so whether the solutions that address reliability, which it certainly is going to be Europe's number one focus for potentially years to come, does that align with climate and clean, or does that diverge in different directions? I think that part is still to come, but I do think there's going to be lasting impact from these events.
And certainly in the short term, Greg, the cheap part isn't playing out with the fossils, because I was talking to someone in Vancouver just this morning. They're paying $1.89 per liter for gasoline, in part because this crisis is just jacking the prices of oil and natural gas through the roof, when at a time they're already going up.
Right.
Yeah, I think one other thing for me that I take away from it is just in general, energy security and reliable, affordable energy is challenging, right? Whether it's produced by fossil sources or the challenges that we'll have to overcome to decarbonize the energy system, right? And I think that's they're going to be different kinds of challenges, but it's not as if the system that we have now or have historically, functions without issue.
Yeah, Greg, I'd love to hear your commentary, because you were a lead author on that 6th assessment report, the second part of which came out earlier this week. I'd mentioned some of the headlines and it triggered. There's lots in there, but I can only imagine that it was completely overshadowed by the war in Ukraine right now.
It was. And, in a way, it's maybe fortunate, because that's the bad news report. That's like, how bad will climate change be? I'm working on the next report, which comes out in early April, about what are the solutions, which could be seen as the more optimistic side of it. But yeah, there's been a lot of work in those reports and a lot of focus to say, when that report comes out, there'll be a lot of tension on this topic. And there was last summer when the first report came out. But yeah, that's not happening right now for good reasons. There's focus in other areas. So, I think that's the other side of a focusing event, is it takes away, it really puts focus on one area. We saw that in the US after 9/11, where it's tremendous resources, tremendous public attention into terrorism and security and related issues. And that is another thing that energy always has to deal with, is there's always going to be competing social priorities. And that's a big challenge when we're talking about a system that's slow to change, a climate system that's slow to respond to our efforts to make it better. And so, yeah, I think that's going to be continually an issue, is how do you make sure climate change gets the public attention it needs when there's always going to be competing priorities. And this is an extreme example, but not infrequent that other things will come up.
Yeah. And think about the opportunity cost of focusing on the war on terror for a couple decades, when perhaps we should have been anticipating war in Eastern Europe a little bit more. Anyway, so we've spent a bit more time on this. It's obviously important. We're paying lots of attention. And it is personal. We've all got connections. I was in touch with a former colleague of mine and of Sara's at the Pembina Institute, whose thankfully family is safe right now, but has close friends that are huddling in the underground in Kiev, worried desperately for their safety and security. So obviously our hearts go out to them, and we all hope for really quick resolution to the war there. Let's pivot to the good news side, the encouraging news side of what we want to talk about today, and that is the focus of Greg's research. So Greg, I want to spend a bit of time just getting you to unpack your research, but why don't we begin, because you were working for a think tank in Silicon Valley back in the heady dot-com days of the late 1990s. And then you initiated graduate studies to understand how energy innovation could be better incentivized. Maybe you could sort of patch those two together. How did you get to that focus in your graduate studies?
Yeah, I did geography undergrad, so I took a course in energy and another course in meteorology and climate change. And so those are kind of on the radar. But I moved in different directions after I graduated, did management consulting. Yeah, worked at a healthcare.com in the late 1990s in Silicon Valley and kind of saw the startup culture. Then worked at a think tank on Sand Hill Road for a couple of years. One report we did in the think tank was we looked at innovation in different sectors, like comparing consumer products, information technology, and healthcare, and looking at things like R&D spending, number of scientists and engineers, patenting, and some of the outcomes. And then we threw in energy as a fourth category just to compare it. And it was just dramatic to me that on every indicator, energy was like an order of magnitude less in terms of investment, R&D spending, people working in the area. And it just didn't really seem to make sense given the issues that were at stake there. So yeah, I went to Berkeley in the Energy and Resources Group and started studying this question that I still work on today is how do we stimulate innovation in low carbon energy technologies? And, one of the ones that first came up was solar. And it really wasn't because there was an implication that solar was going to be the future. It was just more that solar was changing a lot. And it was one that had a steep learning curve. And we could talk about that. So that was the reason for the focus on solar. It just seemed like it was dynamic and something to study. Even at the time, it wasn't something that people would take seriously for addressing energy problems.
Great. So you decided to focus on the solar side of energy. And as I'd mentioned off the top, it had this stunning decrease in cost, sort of 10,000 fold from when it was first used in the mid 1950s, 1,000 fold in the last 5 decades. So maybe now tie in your research that led to the book, How Solar Energy Became Cheap, and then walk us through a little bit, maybe unpack for us a bit more on that severe cost curve decline. How did it happen? It obviously wasn't a straight shot. And then we'll pivot into why it happened.
Yeah. Well, so I guess one thing I would say is that, I was working on that question for quite a while. I spent a summer in Austria, a great place, unpacking some of the reasons for the cost reductions and trying to estimate the different factors, and did kind of engineering-based models and econometric models. And, those all kind of added some insight, but I really did have the feeling after a few years of working on that there was more to the story than those models were revealing. And so the idea there was to add a qualitative aspect to the quantitative work and talk to people, and also to talk to people not in one place, but in many places. And I think that was something that, you mentioned that funding that I got to have the resources and the time to travel and go listen to people in many different places and put it all together was just, I don't know, that was one of my favorite things I've done in my career, because I feel like you learn so much. And especially a story like this, where it's so easy just to say, let's look at Germany, or let's look at Denmark for wind, or look at Japan for batteries, or whatever it is. You want to go deep in that place and understand it. But in the solar case, it really was these international linkages, and it was, partially trade and things like that. A lot of it was just people moving around, like going from one country to another, having kind of idiosyncratic connections to different places, hunting around for used parts to do a startup in China. So those types of kind of international mobility was a really big part of the solar story. And so that's kind of where my research went into, trying to understand kind of qualitatively and get some of these stories from some of the participants that were involved in the different stages.
And tell us just about the research. You went, and I think you had 75 interviews spanning 18 countries. Is that right?
Yep. Tried to talk to lots of people. And a lot of it was trying to get, there was one person I talked to that was kind of a persona non grata in China, because he was the richest person in China for 3 years. And then things turned because they bought a company that had a lot of debt, and things went the other way. And, being able to talk to him, that took a little bit of while, and hanging out and spending time kind of cooling my heels, waiting till it turned out, and then getting the story about like how he set up the first factory and how the first 3 or 4 years went, was, I hadn't seen that anywhere else. But it was such an important part of trying to understand, like, how do these things go from being scientific ideas or just novelties or things that people think might be a good idea to someone actually starting to build stuff and raising the money to do it and finding customers, maybe customers in a different country, and then making that all work. And I think that was, revealing to me, and I think instructive for how we might think of other technologies that might be helpful as well.
I'd like to chime in with an anecdote about how surprising it was. I'm sure you know this paper, Greg. I always find it exciting to be just totally wrong. So this group I was at with Carnegie Mellon did all these papers of so-called expert judgment surveys where we'd interview people. On this paper that Amy Curtright was lead on, and I'm sure you know, that data was gathered in 2007. And we talked to a bunch of people who seemed to be experts in solar technology. And we asked them the probability of getting module prices to under 30 cents a watt by 2030. I've just looked at the data again right now. And basically, they mostly put the probabilities at near zero. Well, no chance of getting that cheap in 2030. And we're basically there now, and it's not 2030 yet. So it's just stunning to me how wrong. And we asked people who were at the forefront of solar R&D.
And I actually on that, Greg, because I know in your book, you talk about how the cost curve decline kind of took a hiatus in 2004 into the late 2000s. And it had to do with the availability of silicon, and that you had that the solar industry was basically hoovering up excess silicon put out by the tech industry at cheap prices. But then because of the growth in German policies at that point, there was such a rush on silicon that it couldn't just hoover up the leftovers. It had to go and source it. And then as a result, then silicon prices went up, and it took 5 years to sort that out. Maybe I've told the story, but I'm sure you could add a lot more color as something that would have been very difficult to predict at the time.
Yeah, I mean, difficult to predict, as David just described. And as he said, those are experts in the industry. And not only they know a lot about the industry, they might also have motivational bias to be optimistic. That's why they're in the industry. And yet they were all wrong. They're all too pessimistic. Exactly. And it's really shocking. But one thing that you see with that is there has been this steady decline in cost that kind of aligns with this idea of a learning curve. But there can be perturbations on that for the same reasons that, last year, 2x4s got really expensive, and then they started becoming less expensive as supply chains were expanded and availability grew. And that was the same thing with solar. It's the same thing with other commodities as well. So we do have these cycles of boom and bust. And in case of solar, it was driven a lot by policy. Like you said, that German policy in the mid 2000s, all of a sudden, the German market expanded, the biggest market in the world, expanded by a factor of 4. And that was great, but it did make it hard to source parts and materials, just like it is today with a lot of things. And that made the cost go up. And we're actually even seeing that today in 2022 or 2021 data with solar and also with lithium ion battery packs for electric vehicles, as the costs have gone up, not a lot, but on the order of 10 to 20% in the last year or so for some of those same reasons. And I get a lot of comments that are similar to what you were saying that people were saying in 2005, 2006, and probably maybe what respondents to David's survey were thinking about as well, is that maybe we hit the end of the learning curve. Maybe batteries got to the end of it because we're running out of cobalt or whatever it is. But I feel like I'm much more optimistic about this long-term cost decline for batteries because it looks so much like solar. And similarly for solar is that you work around those bottlenecks. Maybe you substitute different materials, you expand the supply for things that are constrained right now. And there's still room to run on both of those. But it's good to think about of people being wrong, and also can be wrong by being pessimistic, even experts. But then also that we do have these kind of short-term supply chain issues that could raise prices, even if the long-term trajectory is downward and getting cheaper.
Ed, maybe just one thought on that. I mean, I think, in Alberta, there's often when people are thinking about costs of energy technologies, they are using sort of learning or knowledge that comes from fossil fuel production. And that's where I see one big difference, right? When we talk about, Greg, you were mentioning the potential for sort of these short-term or these supply chain disruptions that can increase costs, say, over a short period of time. But there's this underlying fundamental driver of, the challenge in producing, say, oil, is that you, on the one hand, are improving your technology, but you are fundamentally draining your resources at a pace that is very different, I think, from the pace that we're talking about, the scale of availability of something like cobalt, where, yes, it's we may need to end up producing more, or lithium, or whatever it is, but the available reserves are at a very different scale than, say, what's happened to the cost of oil, where your technology improves, but then you really are actually running through the lower cost production that you have. And so I think that, to me, a little bit explains this difference, or the ability for some of these other energy technologies to continue on relatively steeper cost declines, because, fundamentally the input of the sun obviously is not going away, at least on our life scales. Whereas when you talk about the, non-renewable resources, you are facing depletion. And I think that distinction is actually quite important.
Yeah, so I'd like to go there in our discussion. It seems to me that energy technologies have long learning curves. You look at the oil sands. The oil sands took decades and decades to figure out for it to actually be cost competitive. And some would argue now that in a world, even though the price is high, we're awash with cheap oil and low carbon oil, oil sands oil won't be competitive not too long from now. With solar, when I look at it, it's basically an 80-year trajectory. Whereas you contrast that, say, with microchips and Moore's Law, where you have incredible gains in a half decade. So, but the problem that we faced with the climate problem is we can't wait until 2080 for, say, the cost curve of direct air capture, carbon removal technologies to hit such a point where they can then start to be widely deployed. And then they're not widely adopted by 2100. We have to accelerate that. So, Greg, going back to you in your research, what lessons can we learn from solar and then apply that to other low carbon technologies without having to wait for that cost curve to play out over 80 years?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I mean, that was really a motivation for writing this book too, is just, understand solar, but why? Because we want to use the success. We don't often have something so successful as a model that we can apply. But you're right, it was too slow. We can't just take that and map it on. So a couple sources of encouragement. So one is, there's another technology that's also helpful for low carbon energy, batteries for electric vehicles. And they seem to be going faster than solar did, from kind of development of the technology to early applications to widespread applications. So I was just looking up last night. So the number of electric vehicles on the road is increased by, it was like a factor of 200 or so over the last 10 years. So we're talking about very rapid growth in adoption there, and also a learning curve. So the cost of batteries have come down. So batteries that, today cost something like maybe $10,000 or maybe $5,000 in a small car, we're 10 times that. So like $50,000 or $60,000 just for the batteries in a car 10 years ago. So that's dramatic. That makes a big difference. And the reasons for it are a lot of the same reasons as solar. So the small modular design, where you can take advantage of other markets that were already there, like markets for portable electronics, like laptops and phones, and just string together more and more of the exact same thing. The technology's mature. We don't have to hem and haw too much about which is the right material to use. Let's just keep making more of the same thing and find ways to do it on a bigger scale and faster. Introduce automation, use a lot of specialized machinery. There's not a lot of risk because we know how the materials work and how long they last. So, batteries looks very similar to solar, but has happening much more quickly, and a potentially huge market, and could make a big difference as well. So that's encouraging, especially because it uses a lot of the same mechanisms that solar got cheap with. Then there's other things that have happened that kind of worked in a different way, but maybe have some less direct lessons to apply. So if we think about developing a vaccine for COVID, so that also happened at exactly the same ratio that we need for solar. So if we need, or for future technology. So if we need to go from an 80-year development timeline to 20, the fastest vaccine developed ever was for measles, and that took 4 years. And then last year we did it in 1. And it's different, the smaller technology, and it's biomedical. And so it's really different, but there were things that made it work. There was fundamental science that had been brewing for 20 years, and there was a breakthrough with mRNA. And then crucially, at the time that we thought we might need a vaccine, government stepped in with commitments to purchase. And so the idea of scaling up, testing, doing clinical trials, which takes years normally, could happen a lot faster because there was a guaranteed return if it was successful. And so that's, different technology. So it's not like using lots of battery packs, like lots of little solar panels, but it is similar in terms of the policies, combination of science, R&D, and technology push, and then creating markets that created certainty, that took away the risk. There's always risk with a new technology that people will be averse to. And in this case, government can reduce some of that risk by guaranteeing markets. And in this case, on the level of tens of billions of dollars. So a large investment, but relative to the cost of a pandemic, really a drop in the ocean. And so a smart investment to do. And so I would think for other technologies that maybe can't use the solar model, this focus on making sure there's a market, because if there is a market, a lot of investment and innovation follows.
The COVID example is a good one, and we should acknowledge there is also one accelerant that was present that isn't present in energy technologies, and that is short-term fear for human health and safety, getting to our earlier discussion about short-term crises versus long-term ones. I'd love to unpack a bit more about modularity and its importance. And for our audience, the smaller you have, the smaller a technology, the shorter the time capital stock turnover. So our phones, turn over. We're replacing our phones every few years these days, and that creates a catalyst for producers to keep improving the technology. Our cars are more on the time scale of a decade. I mean, David, to put you on the spot, you dealt with this back in your founding days of carbon engineering when thinking of, are you going to take a small scale approach like another carbon removal company has done versus a large scale approach? How important is modularity in really decreasing that cost curve? And are nuclear plants the example of having something really big that doesn't learn or actually has a negative learning rate and just gets more expensive over time?
I think it's important. So as Greg knows really well, these learning rates really get misused. There's a combination of economies of scale, of supply chain effects, and of actual learning that get folded together to make these so-called experience curves. I think it's really worth picking apart the factors because there's lots of places where we don't see as rapid change. I think there's some particular reasons why solar's fast and other things weren't so fast. So complicated technologies, I don't think it's really just about size, Ed. Screws or nails are quite small, smaller than cell phones, and we don't see those dramatic changes. So it's not about the size. It's about the level of parts and complexity. This is stuff that Jessica Transik's group, I think, has really done some nice thinking about the complexity of the supply chain leading in and about where you're doing the mass production. But I think it's interesting that there have been lots of things we produced at really large scales where we see very little learning over time, and other things where we see rapid. I think one example, I think it's important to think about some important physical differentiators. Solar cells are fundamentally a surface physics phenomena. It's all about the surface. You make the surface purer, you treat it a little better, and you drive the cost down. It's not a bulk process. And I think that's part of the reason it was able to get that big leverage. Part of the reason we have even faster leverage for IT is because IT is a printing technology where you're going as the square, because when you shrink the dimensions by half, you increase the parts count by 4 in 2 dimensions. So I think there's some real reasons why you shouldn't expect that for other things. I don't think batteries will go like solar, and I don't think the evidence of the last few years are that they are. And part of that is that especially if you're looking at the per kilowatt hour cost as opposed to the kilowatt cost, that is ultimately about bulk. And the bulk processing technologies are these kind of chemical engineering technologies, which according to the kind of research that Jessica and others have shown, I think we don't expect to decline that quickly. So for the answers for carbon engineering, we think modularity is crucial, which is why we want to both start cheap and be modular. So the aqueous contactor is inherently really a modular production, and it starts really cheap, which is why we think we have a pathway to do the cheapest thing.
And I think that's an interesting combination too, or if you think about a large scale technology, like one of those direct air capture facilities, but having modularity within that there's many, many contactors that have this modular aspect of them. Maybe you get a bit of economies of scale where you need it, and then modularity.
That to me is why we think we're better off than our competitors, because you want to have the modularity exactly where you want it. So there's a reason why people don't make big pumps or cooling equipment in this millions of little modular ways. So the air contactor wants to be modular, but the gas handling cleanup doesn't want to be modular, because those are technologies where we don't see people aren't making commercial oil refineries that refine a barrel a day, or biofuel refineries, or the materials that process the chemicals that make batteries. Those all want to be big. And so those are where the chemical engineering power laws matter. And you really need to think about which of these you're in to figure out how you want to win. So we did think about that a lot for carbon engineering, and we thought about the different kinds of things that control costs and want to get the best of both worlds.
I think the modularity is also, I would just add that there's even more benefits in being able to come down the cost curve faster the more modular you are, because of the less quantity of money it takes to bite off, a certain chunk of number of units that you produce, right? And so, I actually went back to that one of the papers, Dave, that you mentioned from Jessica, and one of the things that I saw there was, like, in the early years, so leading up to the 2000s, it was really the R&D and efficiency improvements that were responsible for a lot of the cost decline. So, getting better at the sort of, maybe not quite physics, but that closer side or engineering side of it. But that post 2000s, and in that really more aggressive period of cost declines, it really was the economies of scale and, just the plant size of these things. And so the idea that technology that is more modular, it's just simply, we go back to sort of the German story and this idea that there were countries that were willing to step up and say, well, we are going to invest, some significant chunk of money in order to help come down the cost curve by producing, the next order of magnitude of widgets, whatever those widgets are. That's, of course, much easier to do if those widgets each are, 1,000 times or more less expensive. And I think, to me, that's one of the challenges that I see with carbon capture and storage, and in particular, bringing it back home to Alberta. Obviously, we have a lot of the knowledge and engineering ability here, but what I've never been able to wrap my head around is, like, the scale of funding that the province of Alberta, and even, frankly, the country of Canada, could devote to getting cost reductions in CCS through sort of economies of scale or, number of units argument. It's hard to fathom that amount of money really being directed by that country, by our country alone. It would need more. And I think that's one of the big challenges. If you look at the story of the oil sands and the SAGD technology, that was also big, really big technology. But it didn't take very many, certainly much less orders of magnitude of units than the solar production to kind of come down that curve. And part of it was actually some of the early demonstrations actually had higher efficiencies than people were expecting. So, notwithstanding a lot of the engineering work that had to happen in order to get there, it was easier. One other thought, so one other example on the faster side, I think the case of LEDs and LED lighting is a really interesting one, right? There you have, like, the fundamental physics prize, Nobel Prize being awarded for the blue light, which is, of course, part of the white light that we have in our bulbs, in the 90s, right? And you went from that period of the fundamental physics to, it's that's sort of the standard almost now, LED lighting. And I do think that there, and in the example of solar and potential others, that ability to piggyback off of other existing industries is really key, right? And so the idea that solar could hoover up that silicon supply from the tech industry, that it was both cheap to start, but they just didn't have to go and, like, build that whole thing. They could just take and use that part. And so that's another metric. That's one reason that I'm excited about some of these ideas of, like, long-term thermal storage, because where you can put together pieces from existing industries, you have fewer things to solve when you're trying to build something new.
Yeah, especially not having to build a new supply chain. Like, if you can take advantage of parts that are already there, and then later when you get the scale and the technology's proven and everybody wants more of it, then you make those investments, and that's huge opportunities for more cost reductions or performance improvements, because you can direct a supply chain specifically to whatever that is, direct air capture, LEDs, or whatever it is. So, but let's do that helps.
Sorry to interrupt, Greg. Let's talk about that supply chain and international supply chains and unpack a bit more the free flow of ideas, equipment, and people across borders. And I'll give you an example. So in 2015, I put a 4 kilowatt solar system on my roof in a house. Cost me for 4 kilowatts, 14 grand. I did the same in 2017 for another house. It cost me 12 grand. So very quick math, that's a 15% cost decline just in a couple of years. So coming down rapidly. But with that second purchase, my installer said, well, you better get in your order soon because tariffs on imported Chinese panels are about to kick in and you're going to go back up to those 2015 prices. So what do we have right now? We have in Canada a tariff that we put on imported solar panels to basically prop up, and I'm going to get, as I always do, some heated emails on this, a Canadian domestic manufacturing sector, which has in many ways been a failure to launch. And insofar as it's very cyclical, it's small, it's very boutique, and orders basically were the solar panel manufacturer of last resort. When the US can't get panels from elsewhere, we call on our Canadian manufacturers, they hire a bunch of people, they produce for 6 months, and then quietly they lay them off. And the biggest company in Canada is actually a company called Canadian Solar, which is a Canadian in name only, where it's really headquartered in China, and they've got an outpost here in Canada. So we've got this now shrinking world where we're putting tariffs in, we're impeding the flow of equipment across national borders. We're passing on costs to developers at a time when we need more solar. And if anything, in the last 2 weeks, with what's happening in Ukraine, we're going to see further erosion of the flow of equipment and goods across borders. That's what I worry about. So putting it back to the three of you, is that going to then start to bend those cost curves in the wrong direction if we're essentially implementing tariffs and our worlds are getting a lot smaller instead of more globalist?
Yeah, I'm not sure it goes like in the long term. I don't think you can kind of like reverse the learning curve through tariffs. I don't think we'd want to do that to ourselves. But remember, what we want to do is speed things up. We want to go from an 80-year development cycle to a 20-year development cycle. And I mean, everything that I've seen is like the more free flow of ideas, of parts, of people, of money, of machines, of final products, the faster we can go. And so if we're slowing things down, possibly for good reasons, like maybe we want to have some domestic manufacturing, or we are concerned about human rights in other places where manufacturing's happen. So it could be that those are choices for other reasons we want, but we should just be aware that a consequence is that slows down the development process, the adoption process, the scaling up. And so, yeah, that's my biggest concern about tariffs. It's like putting a brake when we need to be putting our foot on the gas to accelerate.
Yeah. And relations between Canada and China are just exceedingly complex. So while you have the development industry coming forward saying, Canada's got a goal, it wants a net zero grid by 2035, putting these tariffs in place to make solar projects more expensive makes no sense. The Canadian government's quick response is, oh, so you want us to do more business with China? They only just recently released the jailed two Michaels after holding them unjustly for 3 years. So just very, very difficult to get that tariff removed right now.
Yeah. But I kind of wonder though, in the longer term, if this becomes less of an issue, because remember what's helpful, what China can do really well is organize a supply chain, source materials from China or from other parts of the world, string together equipment that is, some of it is domestically made in China. A lot of it is purchased from other places too. And China's just incredibly good at that and incredibly ambitious and has no fear of making more capacity than they really need to make. And I think having that kind of ambition and attitude has led to a lot of the success and a lot of cost reductions. Maybe those conditions don't happen everywhere else, but the machines are available. The expertise is available. The supplies are not unique to China. And so if we think about maybe in Canada, maybe in the US, but I'd be more thinking about what about India or Egypt or other places that are rapidly developing that have strong solar resource. Why not do some of the easier to start processes like taking cells and putting them into modules together with glass manufacturing? That type of stuff could start to happen in other places. And maybe you don't need to lean on tariffs as much because some of the knowledge gets spread around and the machines do as well. And so if I were China, I would actually be more concerned about that than about tariffs kind of blocking their exports.
I want to pick up for 1 second. I think one of the things I loved most about your book, Greg, which is really terrific, is it really gives some understanding of the way that what made solar cheap was all these little innovations across the supply chain. And although a lot of the production was in China, that was just the final assembly, if you like. But the production supply chain and the machines that make the machines were really spread pretty globally. And despite the enormous effort at places like Harvard and Stanford and MIT and so on really fancy new solar technologies, which got a lot of science and nature papers and press, they basically were almost irrelevant. What we did was a bunch of little innovations around the supply chain, which beat down the cost of silicon.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, we've been focused, of course, on the module story. The cost of solar involves modules and other components as well. Module costs, of course, have declined and have been the biggest contributor to the reduction in cost. But there are still things that we can do domestically, right? Especially if you're talking about, Ed, like the solar on your rooftop, the soft costs and all of the associated costs with actually getting you as a customer and doing that install and dealing with the permits and all those kinds of stuff. There's a lot more room now there, especially when you look at the relative costs of the modules and the soft costs to continue to increase, decrease costs by targeting that as well too. So I think, the cheaper, of course, the panels themselves get, in some ways, the less important it is to continue to, get them so much more cheaper. I mean, of course, it always makes everything easier if it gets cheaper, but there are these different regimes. And I would say for solar, we've come into the regime where the modules are now at a level that like they are competitive, and it's some of the other pieces that we, might have more to gain on.
Absolutely. And it's also true that, some places, that installation part that you're talking about, the soft cost part, there's big differences in that. Like some places do it really badly, like the US and Japan are really expensive to install solar in those places. But look at a place like Germany and Australia have like half the cost to install the same equipment. And those are not low wage places. They're just places that have figured it out. So yeah, I agree. There's a lot of opportunity there as well.
I got one more question, and then I want to get to audience Q&A. So you'd mentioned the US, Germany, Japan, Australia, most recently China, and perhaps most significantly China. They've all sort of played past the baton in this journey to make solar cheap. Greg, from your research, is there any policy instrument that would provide kind of like a through line across all those countries and all jurisdictions that have contributed to it, or has it been a hodgepodge of different policies?
I think of probably the lesson from that is there's a concept that some political scientists use of policy sequencing, where you design a mix of policies that address different parts of the problem, and that you don't think about it statically. You don't just think about what do we need to do in 2022. You think, what do we need to do to have millions of tons or tens of millions of tons of direct air capture by 2030? What are the set of policies that go from today to 2030? And with solar, we didn't have that comprehensive plan, but what we did have is different countries trying different things along the way. I think that's what made it work, but I think it's also what made it go so slow, is that it wasn't kind of planned as a sequence. It was more, let's focus on the technology now. Okay, maybe it's time to start to experiment with some new markets. Let's see if consumers will take it up if we give them rebates. Oh yeah, they do. Let's see if we can scale it up. Let's give people certainty for larger investments. That's what Germany did. Let's invest in supply chains. That's what China did. So if we could think about that less kind of experimentally and more in terms of a comprehensive sequence, I think that would be another way to get things to move faster, because it's more than one policy. We need different policies at different times. And there's also politics involved with this too, is that some of these policies create new constituencies and beneficiaries of the policies. And that as those start to build and add pressure, maybe then it's easier to create a policy that creates new winners and losers or imposes costs on some of them. And so that's part of it too, is having interest groups along the way changing as well that affect which policies are feasible and which weren't before.
Great. Okay. Let's get to audience Q&A. So our first question is from Jory Vermette. Jory, your mic is live. Go ahead.
Hey, hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome. Perfect. So first of all, thank you. This discussion has been awesome. Just like a recently new viewer or listener, I guess would be the correct word. So really learned a lot so far. But my question is on the topic of price with regards to batteries, whether they're made of cobalt or lithium. Is there a possibility to make them cheap enough within the necessary time frame that, for example, the IPCC report indicates to compete with, for example, more popular forms of energy consumption like light natural gas? How do we make that happen? And then the bonus question would be, how do we make that happen while making it cheaper without significant exploitation of the countries that produce those minerals for the batteries, and without banking on the assumption of future technologies that aren't currently existing or currently feasible, like carbon capture storage, or something that may make battery technology more efficient or cheaper that isn't existing today. So I hope that question made sense. And thank you so much for letting me ask it live.
Greg, do you want to take the first crack?
Yeah. I mean, I think as we kind of mentioned before, there's a pathway for batteries that looks similar to solar. I mean, if you look at the learning curve so far, it's like the same steepness. It's just earlier on. The markets are really large. The expectation that there will be a market if you can make batteries cheaper, and that's a big and growing market. There's benefits to that go beyond climate change, like about, air pollution in cities, for example. So yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons to think that battery technology could get better. It's also similar to solar too. And that, as David said, there's all these exotic ways to turn photons into electric flow. And we've tried lots of things, but we're basically doing this design that was kind of came together in 1985, despite all these alternatives. Same with lithium ion for batteries. But I think that also presents this possibility that we could switch to different materials or different combinations of materials and allow us to maybe substitute away from some of the materials that are difficult to extract, polluting to extract, or have human rights issues associated with their extraction. And so increasingly, though, that's a big part of it, because what we're trying to do is go from today, 1% of vehicles are electric vehicles. They have mainly powered by batteries. And if we need that to go, as you said, to something like 50% or more than that, that's a lot more extraction. So I think, changing that about how we extract and maybe switching the materials is a crucial part of it. But, I think that's possible as well, because there's a lot of science on the different ways that you could store energy in the vehicle, for example.
Great. Okay. I think David, Sarah, and we're going to hold our discussion because we want to cycle through more questions. So we've got next question coming from Tom Cullen. Welcome, and your mic is live.
Thanks very much, Greg. Definitely your book's now at the top of my list. As a longtime advocate for carbon pricing to correct the market failures, we've often cited in broad terms that this would help fund innovation for renewable energy and so on. Can you cite, and maybe you've done the work already, quantitative studies that we can use when we have discussions with politicians or other people to help demonstrate that this isn't just sort of an obvious thing, but who knows if it's really true versus it really is true?
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's two sides of that. So if you price carbon, you've got two things you can do that might help innovation. One is if you're taxing things or selling permits, you're raising revenue, and you could devote that revenue to innovation. And that's one thing that the European Union emissions trading system has done. They have something called the Innovation Fund. And so they take 400 million permits, they take the revenues from those permits, and that raises billions of dollars, and that goes towards funding demonstration projects. So that's one way that carbon pricing can be linked to innovation directly. And the EU has kind of worked on that, and is a second round of doing that program. So that's one I would look at. The second part, though, is that does having a price on carbon create a market or a stronger market for these low carbon technologies? And in theory, of course it does. In practice, the question is how much, and is it strong enough to actually lead to investment? And, now we've got 15 years of carbon pricing in the EU, and we can look at what's happened. And, studies have looked at that. And one thing you see is you see fuel switching. So you do see that companies that are regulated and have to buy emissions permits, have made investments in efficiency to pollute less. Some have switched from coal to gas. And so there's some outcomes there. Do we actually see that we would have a new technology like lithium ion batteries or solar or advanced nuclear start to happen because of a carbon price or an anticipated carbon price? There, we just don't have evidence that that's really happened, because you really have to have a lot of credibility in the price, that the price will be high in the future. And that's something that's been missing. And so maybe that takes time, but we really haven't seen it now. Probably the one, though, that I would also point to if you're looking for evidence is the low carbon fuel standard in California, where you have prices that have been around $200 per ton. And that starts to lead to investment, and it doesn't have to be in California. That's another part of that policy. So I think, yeah, I would look at that one as well as a way in which carbon pricing has had an impact on innovation. But for solar, it didn't really. It was just, all the solar development happened before carbon pricing became substantial.
So
Just to weigh in.
David, go ahead. I know
Yeah.
I want to weigh in, then Sara as well.
Just to weigh in, for example, a central reason that carbon engineering was able to raise any money early on, 2009, was California low carbon fuel standard. And that was because we weren't doing anything anybody expected. There weren't already incentives for carbon removal because nobody had thought about direct air capture. But the whole point was the low carbon fuel standard was technology neutral, but it had a high price. And that was central to us getting started.
Yeah, and the sustained high price of $200, and
Yeah.
it's because of California's largesse. You don't have to be a regulated entity. You don't have to be based in California. It is the single biggest catalyst, I think, for the development of carbon removal technologies, or specifically direct air capture technologies, of anywhere in the world right now. But what I would say, I'm glad we're talking about policy. We jumped over our policy discussion to get to questions. Now we're circling back. Is here in Canada, the single biggest enabling piece of policy that I think we had was Ontario's feed and tariff program, which no longer exists. It really, if you look at the development of solar, was exponential because of it. And yet, when Sara and I would go in and meet with policymakers in Alberta, they would say one thing consistently, regardless of political stripe: we're not going to do what Ontario did, because it involved, as successful as it was, a very statist approach with bureaucrats setting electricity prices, some of which were overgenerous and created some market distortions. But really, we've got so many policies even right now in this country. I was just on a call around the investment tax credit for renewables. We have a program that invests directly in utility scale solar and wind projects, especially with storage. We have a to be unveiled clean electricity standard. We don't know what it is, just was in a platform. Could we not just get at everything and drive the technology deployment that we want with one stiff carbon price? We have that. It just isn't stiff enough, instead of creating this big stack of pancakes, which is the political reality of what we have today. Sorry, that's my little diatribe. Sara, over to you. Then we'll get to one last question.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll pick up on that, Ed. I mean, I think sitting in Canada, we have something that the US doesn't, right? That we have a carbon price. And I would argue that one of the things, though, that we lack is that price certainty, or the high enough price, whether it's, the price today or the price in the future. And so I think that would, when you talk about carbon price being able to drive innovation, you need different policies along the innovation curve, right? And so early stage innovation is probably not going to be driven very much by carbon pricing. But as you get to that later stage, I think we are very much caught when it comes to CCS, for example, in this state now where, the carbon price that we're going to have in theory would be high enough to make some of these projects economic, but there isn't, the financial markets are not sufficiently certain around that price. And so that's where I think that policies, could be used to bring that price certainty forwards, and help make that price more, more bankable today. Ed, just picking up also on the Ontario story that you told, I mean, I think that's another great example where the experience in Ontario, I would classify that as a mix of really electricity and decarbonization policy, but also really industrial and domestic manufacturing policy, right? And part of the reason that those costs were higher in Ontario was because of a decision to require local content and local manufacturing, which, as Greg mentioned, you may be paying more than for that product. We can debate whether that's good policy or not. I think it depends a lot on what you want to see happen with your local, with your domestic manufacturing capabilities. But I think that's one example where it's important, and where the policy space gets so messy, because the tools that you're using, depending on what you're trying to achieve and the ultimate cost of those tools, are going to be really different if your goal is just carbon reduction, or if it is broader economic development skills. So just a kind of note on that.
And usually bureaucrats, my lesson is, they have difficulty doing the two at the same time. They can do industrial development, they can do environmental policy. They have a real tough time coupling them. All right, we're going to get to one more question. Thank you for your patience. We're going to Karen Spencer.
Okay, you can hear me there?
We sure can, Karen. Thanks
Okay,
for waiting.
awesome. So my question takes us back to maybe the very beginning of the discussion with all the uncertainty in Europe. And I was just looking at Germany's actions. They've decommissioned many of their nuclear power plants in the past year or two. And of course, have, I think, the last few shutting down here shortly if they didn't just do it already. And so I wondered, with their putting a halt to the current construction, I believe, and approvals on the main gas line coming from Russia, what are your comments on potentially reversing some of those decisions, given the need for the large predictable base energy volume that they have over there?
The only thing I would say is that, that German decision on nuclear power is rooted in like the 1968 protest movement. So there's a lot of history behind that. That's already been through a couple oil crises, and now we've got in another gas crisis in 2006 or 7 or 8 it was. So yeah, I think there's potential for that to get reversed again, but hard to predict at this point where it's going to go. And there's lots of different voices in Germany, especially about whether they should go all in on renewables, for example. Others that want to keep the nuclear option alive, and yeah, so we'll see on that one, I think.
Yeah, I think there has been some, comments made by parts of government that have been historically against or sort of for the shutdown of nuclear plants, saying that they're willing to, consider keeping them open just for that reason. And so I think it sort of comes back to that point that we were discussing in the beginning, that, a real crisis creates a focusing event, and people are willing to touch potential solutions or discuss solutions that they may have been completely unwilling to do in previous times.
There's 4 gigawatts operating still, if I've got the numbers right, and they're scheduled to be shut down this year. And that's the latest number I saw. And my read from Germans is they might still do it, but maybe they'll push it out another year. I think it was crazy to shut them down, but obviously I'm not a German voter.
And let's also think of Japan and its catalyst being the Fukushima crisis triggered by the tsunami in 2012. And even back then, I think they only had 2 of 55 units that were operating, and they took those 2 offline only to bring units back online because they needed the power. And now I think they've decided to take remaining units permanently offline. I'm not aware of the timeline for it.
It's a good reminder, I think, that when we look at all these energy models and what should happen and what the lowest costs are and all these things, that, we have energy systems that very much live in the world of humans that are making decisions. We can say they're not rational, or maybe they're rational within the world that we live in, but that it's messy.
And being married to a Japanese woman, I've family that post Fukushima went and helped out with some of the rebuilding and recovery efforts. And so it's hard for me to tell them on a rational basis, but you need that nuclear power compared to the alternatives. They said, well, you weren't there helping us to rebuild these towns. Okay, we're going to leave it at that. We've gone a bit overtime. Thanks to everyone for hanging in. Listen, Greg Nemet, a big thank you to you. This is the second time in the last 6 months that I've monopolized an hour of your time. We're really grateful. You were a terrific guest today. Thanks very much.
Pleasure. Enjoyed the discussion with all of you.
Thanks, Greg.
A reminder that this episode is going to be available at energyversusclimate.com for later listening, and as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Don't forget to rate us, please. Our next episode is going to drop in mid-March, precise date TBD. David, Sara, and I are going to do a dive into the energy and climate dimensions of crypto and experiment with drinking and recording at the same time. We'll
betting.
Yes. We'll have a few surprises, including the news that now we're becoming budding crypto investors as a learning experience as part of this. So some of us.
You're going to give way. You're going to give way.
Yeah, we'll work on Sara. We've got some Dogecoin lined up for her. Give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com, or I should say now, let me take that back, info@energyversusclimate.com. You can support us at energyversusclimate.com. You think I could say that by now. Very big thanks to Christina Pearson, Crystal Hickey, and our very patient producer, Eva Voinigescu, for their help today. And we'll see everyone next time. Take care.